Let's drink some coffee. Let's pump some iron. Let's start a company. It's Coffee Moguls. It's Coffee Moguls. Welcome everyone to Coffee Moguls, episode 0. Our guest on the podcast today will be Nat Bennett of simplermachines.com, a software engineer obsessed with distributed systems and observability. How's it going, Nat?
Hi there, it's going all right. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm doing well. I'm just enjoying a cup of Proyecto Diaz coffee here. It's the El Corazon from Africa and Latin America with notes of chocolate, malt, oak, and berries. How about you? Did you get caffeinated today?
I did. You know more. So you specifically said drink coffee. I love drinking coffee. My partner is the one who makes it. I am aware that what we drink is washed? No, the newer process, the like fermented thing. It causes coffee to taste like cherry sometimes. But this is about the outer limit of what I know about the coffee that I drink. I drink very fancy, very pretentious coffee that I know almost nothing about.
Good stuff, good stuff. I mean, fancy, pretentious coffees, like, that's all good with me, so...
This is how we've been surviving the pandemic, right? Is like, we have a daily, like, we get up, he makes coffee, I drink the coffee, we sit, we talk, we have, like... a nice sensory experience. It's different every week because we've got different coffees, and it's just like that's been how we've been dealing with the whole, we're at home. I mean, we're lucky enough to be in the group of people who's like at home.
That's awesome. Tell me a little bit more about this washing the beans thing.
Oh, well, okay. So there's different ways to get the actual coffee, like, fruit part off of the coffee bean. I think historically people have, like, there's sun drying it, and there's washing it, and there's fermenting it, and you get different flavor profiles out of different processes. And so that's what I've been hearing every morning now when we get new coffee is like, oh, this is this or that other process. And I'm like, that's nice. This tastes good. This is very nice coffee.
There you go. Well, this is a welcoming podcast to all coffee fans. You don't have to brew it. So if you just enjoy it as well, you're also welcome here, so that sounds fun. Yeah, I agree. My daily kind of brewing and drinking of coffee is a good respite from all the things that are going on out there.
It's good to have a vice.
Exactly, and I've got a couple, but coffee is really the main one I'll be discussing on this podcast.
Right? Yeah.
So just to get started here, why don't you tell us about yourself? What's your story?
Yeah, okay. Let's see. I have no business being in the career that I'm in. I was an English major in college. Graduated in 2011, 2012, don't remember exactly. Got into software. Was suddenly surrounded into a software company, was doing data entry, was suddenly surrounded by software engineers who were solving problems with computers. And I suddenly went like, oh, this is just writing, but the computer also reads it? I can do this. I know how to do this. Bounced around a little bit, ended up at Cloud Foundry, did that for 4 years. Ended up there specifically actually because I started software with Ruby. This was another big part of like, oh, hey, I can do computers, right? I always thought that this was something like I don't know, it was mostly like really hard math. I had this image in my head that programming had something to do with quadratic equations, and I was like, I don't understand what those are. But it turned out it was just like logic, and like the Ruby community is really friendly and really focused on the way that code reads, right? And I was like, okay, I understand these people, I understand this. Which meant that I got into TDD really early, and I got introduced to the concept of pairing really early. And so then I went to Pivotal to like understand what that world looked like. And then about a year ago, Pivotal was acquired. And at that point, I'd been there for 4 or 5 years. I'd spent a bunch of time building software this way. I talked about it a little bit on I think I called it the mortifying ordeal of pairing all day. Like, it's an intense practice, and I'd done enough of it.
Right. So I'm going to actually stop you there because we're getting a little ahead. But one thing I did want to talk to you about is that article. So just to catch the listeners up a bit, Nat is actually Hacker News famous.
Yeah, turns out you just you write something that makes people mad, and then they put it on Hacker News, and then 5 minutes later they're arguing about what it's like to be in the Marines.
That actually sounds pretty accurate. Like one of your surefire best ways to get the attention on those kind of sites is to just write something controversial, or I imagine pairing especially is a pretty hot button topic. So before though we just kind of throw this at people, why don't you maybe catch everybody up on like what pairing is, and then kind of introduce what was this article about that got all this attention.
Yeah. So pairing is there's a couple of different implementations. Pairing is two engineers, or two just anybody, but in this context, it's engineers working on the same thing at the same time. So in like the pivotal context, this means two engineers at the same workstation, and you have two keyboards and two monitors, and two mice, and two chairs side by side. And you're both inputting into the same machine. You have the workstation mirrored across the two monitors, and generally one person is typing it at a time, and you're both talking about what you're doing as you're doing the work, and there's a lot of different like details and ways that it might vary slightly from that setup, but that's basically what it is. And it's a relatively controversial practice, I think, less so than it used to be, actually, because like to some people it sounds immediately like just like totally nuts. Like, why would you have two engineers doing the work that one engineer could do? And like why you do that is a really, really deep topic that I'm like not even going to try to cover here. ThoughtWorks actually has a really, really good like roundup. I think it's called like on pairing. If you have show notes, we can link to it in the show notes. But just like, why would you do this? What benefit would you get?
Right. Well, and I think it's worth noting too that Pivotal, where you were working, is just all about that pair programming life.
Yes, the part of it that I was in, anyway. It's worth mentioning that Pivotal also had, like, Pivotal was a complicated company. It also had things like, Pivotal made Spring, the Spring, the Java framework. Those folks mostly did not pair. They didn't come out of the Pivotal Labs heritage. But the part of it that I was on, Cloud Foundry, and in particular, like the San Francisco office, that worked on Cloud Foundry. Yeah, everybody in that office, pretty much all the engineers were pairing most days. And you do that for 4 or 5 years, and a couple of things happen. One is that you get really, really good at like doing things in groups, like cooperating. So, funny story. I live with the first person I ever paired with right now. I'm engaged to marry, actually, the first person that I ever paired with, like, seriously.
Wow, I never thought about that as a potential benefit or side effect, but you never know what's going to happen when you get, behind the keyboard with someone.
Yeah, so this is actually in one of the, like, I'm pretty sure this is in XP Explained. Kent Beck is like, all right, young, impressionable nerds, you're going to want to sleep with your pair sometimes. Don't do that. Yeah, well, like you're in contact with a person, right? And their thought processes for, right. Even if it's just a couple hours a day, right? Like it's this deeply intimate thing that you're doing of like you synchronize with this person, right? You're thinking, you're explaining your thoughts, the other person is reacting to your thoughts, and like you kind of have to bring yourself into alignment with that person about what you're doing and why for the pairing to be successful, which is this really intimate thing. And if you haven't done that before, and if you haven't especially if this is like your first experience with, sort of intense intellectual intimacy like that, you can end up mistaking that experience for all kinds of other things. Yeah, in my case, it ended up like we paired. I joined Pivotal. We were put on the same project. We paired for 6 weeks only with each other. It was like a one-pair team, which is kind of unusual because generally at the end of a one-pair team of like a couple of months, you're kind of never going to want to talk to that person again. Like if you're only pairing with one person, with most people, like I know people who have gone through this and they've been like, "You're a great engineer. I really respect you. We can never be on the same team again." Not because there's anything bad about that person, but it's just like if you're in like this tight, people spend a lot of time dating and like trying out what it's like to spend a lot of time with another person. In part because like compatibility is really important, right?
Right. Like in any work relationship, you're gonna have some different spectrum of chemistry, right? Some people you really enjoy working with, some people you don't. I gotta imagine pairing really just ratchets that up a lot.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And when you really click with someone, it's fantastic. It's like some of the best days of my life were, a really good pairing day where like you do something that neither of you could have done on your own, and you do it like 3 or 4 times as fast as you might have otherwise.
Well, I think that's one of the big benefits of it potentially, and actually for anyone who maybe is listening out there and they aren't a programmer or maybe don't even work in tech at all, it is not uncommon for programmers to occasionally sit together and chew on a problem when it gets really hairy, but what is very unusual and distinct about this model is it's extremely uncommon for programmers to do that all the time and with regularity.
It's more common than it used to be, I think. Weirdly, I think this is something where the pandemic has changed things. It used to be, it's often one of the barriers to pairing in a lot of environments is that you don't have a good, comfortable setup for both people. Like if you want to pair with somebody, either somebody's looking over somebody's shoulder, or you're both kind of like squeezed in front of the desk, and you just like, you don't have that 2 screens, 2 keyboards, 2 input devices setup. But remote pairing, even though it's got a bunch of other disadvantages, one of the things that's nice about it is that you can link up and both be using like Zoom in the share screen or Tmux or some other tool that's for pairing specifically.
I find it interesting that you kind of have noticed that the pandemic probably changes that a bit, because one of the things that was probably awkward about it before is you got to get up and go to someone else's desk in someone else's place that's not comfortable to you, and maybe even like try to use someone else's keyboard. I mean, programmers, can you like use anybody else's keyboard? Because I can't. It's always like Dvorak or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Well, if I can use their keyboard, I probably can't use their command line. I probably can't use their Vim config. This is one of the things that was really unusual about Pivotal, and that like I'll ask people, for instance, if I'm in a job interview, I'll ask, how are your workstations set up? And people will look at me like I'm crazy. And they're like, what do you mean? How are, like, people just set up their workstations? And I'm like, you don't have like the team file? You don't have the person who maintains the workstation set? Like, you don't have the image that's like because all the machines per team, they don't have, it's not, each team generally maintains its own workstation setup, because like if you want everybody to be using the same set of machines, if you want everybody to be comfortable on a pairing station, you have to have everybody's tools, aliases, IDEs. Teams at Cloud Foundry were generally either JetBrains teams or Vim teams. There were a handful of teams that were engaged in sort of a slow Cold War, like a civil war, over what IDE they were going to use.
Yeah, I can imagine that's difficult to sort out among all the different programmers. hey, which thing are we all going to standardize on? So you all at Pivotal are kind of, for these years that you're working there, you're the equivalent of these folks in Pacific Rim, drifting in the Jaegers, tackling kaiju, which I'm just going to assume kaiju are bugs in this instance, or deadlines. And so why don't you tell me a little bit about the article that you wrote, because I found it really interesting.
Yeah. So this article that I wrote, I guess the short version is I talk a little bit about like, I open up a little bit with talking about some of the advantages of pairing and like the experience of pairing, because it really is, there. I open up with this line, the mortifying experience of pairing all day, and that's a quote from a New York Times editorial of like, everybody wants the the benefits of being loved, but you have to submit to the mortifying ordeal of being known. And pairing is kind of this weird, but highly concentrated version of this human experience, right? Of like wanting to merge with another person or make contact with another person, with another entity outside of yourself. And then both the like the great things about that and the terrifying things about that. Because it is just the feeling of doing something with another person. Like I said, that like neither of you could have done on your own, and entering this gestalt entity of like the pair.
Right, but you're also kind of like vulnerable in front of someone else. Like, what if they think I type too slow, or that I'm dumb, or something like that?
Or just like, what if they know me, right? Like, there's a little bit of just like, not even them judging me, but just like, oh no, another person is gonna like see who I am, and am I ready for that?
Right, or apparently, what if I accidentally get engaged to them?
Right. Yes. Yeah. What if I actually? Yeah. We got to the end of that 6 weeks, and I was like, we don't hate each other. Like, we should keep hanging out.
That's the foundation for a solid relationship right there. Don't hate each other. Yeah.
Yeah. We sometimes argue about estimates. He'll be like, oh, how long is something gonna take? And I'll be like, hey, you asked me for a time-based? I can't do that. I can't give you a time-based estimate. What are you like, what's wrong with you?
Like, that's not how an artiste works, right? Like, we're code artistes here.
Right, yeah. I don't know how long it's going to take until it's done. If you want to give, I can give you risk and complexity. The point of the article was talking about how I ultimately left Pivotal/VMware for a variety of reasons, but one of them was just like I got to the point where I could not pair anymore. I had an experience, especially like right around the time the pandemic hit, where I lost some cognitive capabilities. There were a couple of weeks where like my partner would order Thai food for me every night, because the act of like deciding what I wanted to get and then navigating the website to get somebody to bring pad thai to me was like an insurmountable problem.
Damn. Yeah, like, that's burnout when you can barely even order food on Grubhub.
Yeah, I was like, this is the bare minimum of human being okayness, right? Like, I can't even manage this. And, in fairness to pairing, there were a lot of other things that were going on during that period. Like, this was right when everybody went home for the pandemic. Pairing was just this really cognitively demanding activity. And Pivotal is unusual even amongst companies that pair, in that it did for a while expect people to pair for, a full 7 or 8 hours a day, especially the consultants, the labs folks. Most places that pair do it for 4-6 hours a day at most.
Well, even that sounds like a lot. The same thing that makes it really useful, the fact that it's really focused, and it's this activity that you just have to keep going because there's another person there. There's no opening Twitter and goofing off.
Yep.
Is the same thing that makes it exhausting.
Yes.
Simultaneously kind of makes it effective that you're there, the other person's going to help you get to the other side. but also like kind of takes away your ability to decompress and have freedom and that kind of thing too.
Yeah, this is one of the things that like that people don't is easy to underestimate about preparing, especially if you haven't done it, is that like one of the reasons that it's not actually you're having your engineer's productivity is that generally a pair is going to get much more like, I don't want to say work because it's not work. There's all kinds of different work in software, but just that like sitting down and grinding out code kind of stuff, that just sort of straightforward execution. A pair is likely to make more forward progress of that specific type than a single engineer working alone, because a pair is going to spend more of their day just like focused on, hands on keyboard, looking at the IDE than a single engineer will.
Do you think that that kind of takes away though from some of that spontaneous ingenuity that sometimes kind of comes out of solo contributors?
I think it can. I honestly don't have as much experience as I would like working on stuff solo. Like, part of the reason that I am spending some time this summer like studying and working on a newsletter instead of jumping straight into another job is like I have to figure out what it's like to work on my own, right? I don't have a ton of experience, but yeah, I think it's so Pivotal descends from Pivotal Labs, which was an XP consultancy, and a good extreme programming, I should say, like extreme programming. Hacker News described extreme programming as the feral cousin of Scrum.
Sounds accurate.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with it, extreme programming explains, but like variant of Agile, heavy on the specific engineering practices, TDD, Scrum, a particular approach to story planning. But a good XP like engagement, a good classic labs engagement is doing a little bit of a magic trick where it's demonstrating for about a 6-month period how much of a particular kind of work engineers can get done when they don't have anything else to do except write code. And like they pull out a lot of the kind of meetings that people tend to have to be, especially in like these big enterprise environments that they're pulling people out of. And you have them pairing and you have them doing TDD, and you can get a lot done with that set of practices, and you get a lot done very quickly. But it's a little bit like, are you familiar with German, like classic German forestry?
Of course. I mean, who isn't, right? No, I'm not.
Have you read the book Seeing Like a State?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. The book Seeing Like a State is a great book. It's all about the attempts that states have made, that like large institutions have made to optimize the world so that they can extract more value out of it, basically, so that like they can get more taxes and more labor of various kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And it opens with this discussion of German scientific forestry, which, like, go read the book. I won't be able to do it justice. The short version is, if you manage a forest scientifically, in the sense of, like, you plant all just one kind of tree, and you plant it in straight rows on a big grid, and you plant them all at the same time, so they'll all be ready to harvest at the same time, and you pull out every other organism from a forest. The first tree harvest is going to be great. You're going to get actually like way more wood than you normally would out of that forest. Both because it's like easier to harvest the trees when they're all identical, and just they're going to grow amazingly well.
Right, efficient.
Yeah, the second harvest, the trees are all just going to die.
Right. There's no biodiversity, and it's kind of like, I mean, is it because they pull all the nutrients out of the soil?
Exactly. Yeah, there's no regenerative processes. You've extracted, you've strip mined. I don't know the word, but the Germans have a word for this, of like forest death.
Mm.
And you don't have any regenerative processes, and so you have this like amazing productivity in the first run, and then it just falls off a cliff because it turns out you were, borrowing productivity from the future, basically. And so that's how I started to think about at least that era of XP, this full on like everybody pairs and we're driving really hard in one direction for, X months, and we're working 8 hours a day. When you have this really powerful engine of like, you put a story shaped a particular way in front of a team and then it gets done, that like the working, XP team presents, there's a temptation to just sort of keep feeding work that team can do into that team.
Like kind of the hazards of success.
Yeah. We had this interesting problem at Cloud Foundry where we were shipping features actually faster than customers often could consume them. We got really, really, really good at shipping new features. That's a entirely other discussion for another time, I think, because like I could go really deep on like the release engineering work that we did to support that. But the short version was that we had these engines, we had these teams working on different components that were churning out new code at a really high rate, and then we had a bunch of machinery that we put in place to give them feedback quickly and let them like integrate regularly, and like generate a new artifact, often once every couple of days if it was just a little like, bug fixes and especially CVE, like security fixes. And our customers kept falling further and further behind until lots of people in the ecosystem were on, years old versions of the software.
Right.
And I think they have since like kind of pivoted and they're approaching it in a different direction. But it's actually really hard. Like the aggregate was too much. This is the kind of problem that requires like stopping and thinking.
Well, and I feel like, in an organization, everyone's going to be egging you on to always go faster, always ship more.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of interesting you bring up that the customers were feeling like you're shipping too fast and they can't catch up, which in a way is kind of a byproduct of the nature of that specific business, right? Because it's like on-prem software and so, but how is that supposed to like make you feel, as someone who hit the road hard to get it out,
Right. Yeah. Engineers, engineers like humans, crave impact. I think this is actually one of the like basic, this is my personal theory of like why people like art and why people like making art. Changing your environment, changing your physical environment feels good. Just like having control. And so like, but also engineers crave impact. Engineers crave, solving problems and solving problems for other humans, I think. I really think it's undercounted in our industry how much a lot of people in it care about other people and like solving other people and improving their lives. So, yeah, and so like it's disheartening when it feels like you're just shipping stuff into a void, when you don't. This is one of the reasons that like a lot of folks I know have left. Like one of the classic reasons that one leaves Cloud Foundry or on-prem software in general is to go to a SaaS where you get to see the impact of your work immediately. And you get to talk to customers, especially, I'm really big on, engineers joining like design activities. So like going and talking with customers directly, for reasons other than the thing broke. Cause that's the other piece of this is that like, if you're not going out and like interacting with customers, for non-customer service reasons, you're only ever going to talk to the people whose stuff is breaking all the time, who are unhappy with it. And that's also, I think that this is one of those things that like ended up contributing to burnout, for me, was just like all this work that I did, that we did, that the teams did, that I was like proud of in theory, but it was like, it could take 18 months actually, for something to get from developer workstation to real production, which is the customer site.
Right. Yeah, and there's nothing more, disheartening than that, right? I hear that criticism or sort of that cited a lot as a reason for maybe leaving a big company is, hey, I could work on unit tests for 18 months and kind of ship like one line of code a week. Or I could really, go to a startup. Maybe it doesn't pay as much, but I can get code out tomorrow. And that's a big positive feedback loop. And then also the things you mentioned about getting engineers involved with product, with people who love the product, really seeing the faces, right? Because it's so easy to work in software and you never actually meet your users at all, or see the positive change you've caused for people. I definitely can relate to that. So a couple of things I did want to make sure we cover because we had talked about them a little bit before we started, and I think they're really interesting topics. So one, something that's on everyone's minds and lips right now is the role of politics in business, in startups. You and I have both worked for mostly companies where they are kind of pure software.
Jobs that you cannot explain to your parents or your friends outside the software industry.
That is a great way to put it. Yeah, like if you work for Uber or something, it's pretty easy. You just tell people, yeah, Uber, like the app, I work for them. It's a lot harder to, I don't think most people even really know what monitoring is, much less Pivotal, Cloud Foundry, and Docker and all that.
Yeah, for the most part, people don't understand. Like, it's really hard to talk about that job. Yeah.
If you were just looking at it at a very surface level, you could probably make some sort of argument that was along the lines of, this is quote-unquote pure software.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much just like those gray people in Futurama.
Mm-hmm.
It's not political, it's apolitical. But is it?
Yeah. I think of making software as an inherently political act because making software is a vote for a certain kind of world. Seeing like a state is all about the efforts of governments to understand, track, and manage the land and population that makes them up. This is a deep interest of institutions since, this is how we mark the beginning of history. History is the part of time where humans were writing things down. And what were they writing down at first? They were writing down how much stuff is where and who owns it and how much it's worth. And this is one of the basic activities of software. This is one of the core things that we do with software is we make it easier to keep track of who is where, what do we know about them, who owns what stuff, and the tracked and untracked worlds and the described and undescribed, the act of describing something with software changes that thing, because it makes it, more visible to various people, right? More visible to other individuals, more visible to the government, more visible to whoever it is who's running that software system. And I don't know that there's anything that individual software software makers can do with that information. But it does make me really uncomfortable with the idea that okay, this is this pure unpolitical, there's no political implications to the act of creating software. It's well, I'm casting my vote for a world where more people know more things about more things, for good or for ill.
Well, and I might submit that there's totally things people can do. They can push back, for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah. They can have a voice about how the software that they create should be used in the world, right?
Yeah, that's true. There's stuff, Dragonfly, right, or Maven. Most of the DevOps people that I know are queer. Not universally, but it's just a really, queer and funny hair and kind of lefty. And it turns out it really does look like if you absolutely can't get anybody from that world to run your software, you kind of can't be on the internet. And I don't even mean actually in terms of if AWS kicks you off, you can't get on the internet. But if you can't get competent software professionals, competent software operators to run your software for you, you're going to have a bad time. You see these things like Parler and Gap, for instance, right, that are like kind of trying to break off from like the mainstream platforms. And they're bad software. They've got technical limitations. And it's going to be really interesting to see if that stays. But it does seem like there's this sort of penumbra, right? There's this like outer edge to what the software professional industry in general is interested in working on. I actually don't think that's even like for political reasons. I don't think it's so much about the politics of those particular people. I think it's basically if you get far enough out on some particular fringe of political whatever that you're like solidly in the scamverse, you stop being able to run good software.
Well, it certainly is an interesting point. I think that you're at the whims of people who can actually operate and deploy this software, right? And there are definitely segments among that population kind of skew a certain way, have a lot of correlations. So that's an interesting point, and I think it comes back to this idea, which I'm now thinking should be the title of this podcast episode: "Your software is your vote." What you're actually out there doing with these abilities that we have is inherently a political act. So you used a phrase that I really liked earlier, which was that even in these kind of pure software companies, you're making these force amplifiers.
Yeah, force amplifiers. I've been putting software up on the internet in the last couple of weeks. I put up a Ghost site. Ghost is what backs simplermachines.com. I deployed a couple of Ruby applications, Ruby on Rails. I'm following a tutorial. So I've got some DNS set up in AWS. I've got Ghost running on Ghost Pro. I've got a couple of little things running on Heroku dynos. This was all like dramatically easier than it would have been, 10, 20 years ago. Because I don't have to solve a bunch of problems that are the same for every application. Because this is what software does really well. It's like you take a process that's the same or isomorphic given a set of parameters, and you just do that forever, over and over again. And so now I'm able to put a lot more software on the world. Or actually, this is an even better example. Force multipliers. One of the things that's cool about being in this industry, that's cool about being a software engineer, is I think unlike a lot of products, the more software engineers there are, the more demand for software there is. The more demand for software engineers there is.
Right. That's one of several reasons I'm not too worried about the field going away or kind of, us losing leverage in terms of our ability to have good jobs and that kind of thing. It's software just creates more software, right?
Yeah. You look at something like Stripe, right? Stripe, 5-10 years ago, Stripe, well, I guess Stripe existed 5 years ago, but it wasn't big enough, wasn't the big deal that it is now. You look at something like Stripe, and like, I had this like, I don't know, mindset shift a few weeks ago, where I realized that like, it's actually really easy now for me to build a website that takes money, right? Like I just hook it up with Stripe, and so I can start looking at problems and think like, okay, is the only reason that this doesn't have some software like solving this problem that like the value of solving this problem wasn't worth it to write a bad version of Stripe 10 years ago?
What do you mean? Like, can you explain that?
So like one of the things that I've been considering is, for fun, basically, writing my own like subscription page.
Okay, yeah.
Because like there's like Ghost has a subscription thing that you can do, and there's options like Patreon. But I could also probably put up a page that had some buttons for different things, and back that with Stripe. And then I've got my own like very, very customized like subscription and billing site. And this would not have been possible, 10 years ago. Like me is just like a random lone programmer just putting up a tiny Patreon clone for fun.
Yeah, well, and it has a lot of advantages, right? One is you wouldn't have to pay Substack and kind of take on the risk of Substack if it was sort of a newsletter-based thing. But another big one is if you start getting into a product who is outside of the rails of what those platforms directly provide, you now have that billing system. So it goes beyond, I think, just save the extra 10% or whatever off of what Substack or Patreon or whoever wants as their cut. It's that you can really have a custom thing to deliver a product that, whether it fits in the rails of what they expect or not, you can still get that to people. So
yeah. And like, I think we tend to think of I at least tend to think of software as stuff that's built once and then sold to like millions of people.
Well, it's the beauty of it, right? It's infinitely copyable.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think of SaaS and like enterprise software. Software can also be built once and sold to like 1,000 people or 10,000 people. And you don't have the same like crazy benefits of scale.
You do, though, because if you started, say, a artisanal wood carving business or something like that, good luck selling 1,000 of those things overnight. It's not going to happen. You have a bottleneck. Whereas with software, just send them the copy, right?
Mm-hmm. And those are the kinds of things where like lowering the fixed costs starts to become really like useful and valuable. Things like Heroku or Cloud Foundry, or even to some degree Honeycomb, right? Like anything that lowers the barrier to entry makes it more possible and more attractive to build like software for smaller groups of people.
Well, I think things like Honeycomb will be huge because it's just getting cheaper and cheaper in a way to actually operate stuff effectively and be able to troubleshoot in production, which previously was only for the elite.
Oh, it's so great. It's amazing. Like there's all this stuff. I'm so excited about, like, I want to make my own software, right? I want to make software that like just I worked on, and I'm kind of overwhelmed actually of this, like how much stuff is available for at a small scale for just free, right? Like Amplitude, Honeycomb, Ghost is not free, but it's not very expensive. Datadog, right? Like you can use this like really powerful enterprise grade technology for your little Hello World app if you want to. Which is just, this is one of the reasons I promised you that I was going to talk about like why I think more software people should be starting their own things.
Yeah, this is a great segue actually. Go ahead and tell us why you think more people should start their own thing.
A couple of reasons. The kind of frivolous but really important to me one is I don't have to argue with anyone. I don't have to convince anyone of anything anymore, right? I don't have to be like, I don't have to go through this whole song and dance of like, okay, I have to find the problem that this tool that I want to use solves really well, and then I have to build a proof of concept, but I have to do that like on the side while I'm also doing my other job, which I know isn't as important as getting this, whatever this thing is in. But like, nobody else believes me, so I have to do all this like convincing and talking to people, and like that's good work, it's important work, but I'm so tired of it. And so it's kind of amazing to be able to just like sign up for stuff, and then I'm using it. And especially in this world now, where AWS gives you an Amazon grade infrastructure team through an API. I can get a Honeycomb grade observability team through an API. There's no way that I could run something like that on my own.
Yeah, well, and if you think about it, it's all just becoming even more and more pronounced, because I think it's pretty well known that there's been this shift from, you used to have to like pay Cisco $100,000 a year just to get a website off the ground, and you needed full-time network engineers, and Amazon, when they started, that was a very different ball game to get something off the ground than what we have today. But if you think about it, now that we have AWS, it's not just that there's this linear progression from we didn't have AWS, now we do. It's that AWS has enabled all these other force amplifying things that also make other things easier. So
yeah,
I'm inclined to agree. I forget exactly where it was, I read it, but someone was saying, I think we're going to see our first $1 billion company that's just one person sometime soon. Mm-hmm. And I can see that with all this stuff we have available.
Yeah, because it's like it's not a one-person company, really. I mean, this is actually like the sort of really powerful thing about capitalism, the thing that I really like about like markets, and a lot of this like capital infrastructure that we've got built around. You know, I have again a whole rant about the problems with that system that we're currently living in. But one of the cool things is it allows cooperation at scale between these massive networks of people, in a way that's kind of invisible to most individuals. You know, because this software company, you know, any given software company these days, even a one-person software company, has participation from thousands of engineers in it, often.
Yeah. Either directly or indirectly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because you're using open source software, you're using various SaaSes, like you're taking a little tiny, you know, you're taking one copy of these things that are being copied, you know, many times, and you're able to bring that to bear on your particular problem. And I think that that's reduced the size of problem that individual people can attack, which is exciting. I've been reading a lot of Patrick McKenzie. Have you read much Patrick McKenzie, like Patio 11?
Oh yeah, I'm
okay.
like basically like Patrick McKenzie Bible thumping.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought you might be, because you're doing the same thing that I'm doing, which is like, well, I don't know what I'm gonna build, so I'm gonna start with a marketing platform, right?
Right. Actually, that's a great segue into the next thing I was going to bring up, which is that, I mean, certainly a lot of the pushback that you might get on the idea of software engineers should just go do their own thing. They create a lot of value, and they should kind of claim as much of that as possible.
Yes.
Of course, you know what people are going to say, which is, well, but then you have to do everything. You have to invoice people, and you have to sell and market, right? And
sure,
those are distinct skills that are separate from software engineering.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about building your own marketing channel.
Yeah. So you do have to do everything, but you also get to do everything. And you know, I'm originally an English major, right? I picked that because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and I figured, well, if nothing else, I'll be able to write a good email.
Yeah, my degree's in philosophy,
yeah,
so
exactly.
Similar,
Yeah.
Just like philosophy.
Yeah. I like doing lots of things, right? Like, there's the Heinlein quote, specialization is for insects.
Exactly.
And, you know, there are really good reasons to specialize also. But I'm kind of attracted, honestly, to the idea of getting to do my own sales, my own marketing. I like writing. I like talking to people. I like talking to people about software problems. I like learning new skills. You know, I'm not going to be as good of a salesperson as somebody who's done that their whole life, and that's the thing that they study. That's the thing that they specialize in. But I can probably be a good enough salesperson, and likewise, I can probably be good enough at marketing.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of sales, like, there's usually no one better than the person who created the thing and is passionate about it.
Yeah.
To really sell it.
Yeah, well, the nice thing about a really small, like a single-person operation is you've got really clean incentives. One of the things that's frustrating about being, especially a very large company, is the incentives, like, the further you get from the, like, edges of the company, the like outer surfaces where it connects to, but even then, actually, even those like contact points, you know, sales, customer service, that kind of thing. The incentives at large companies get very weird. It's really hard to measure. It's impossible. It's impossible to measure the impact that an individual has on the operation of the whole system.
Yeah.
You know, this is like systems thinking 101. I think this is like Deming, where like you can optimize the heck out of a particular part, and it may or may not improve the overall system in any way. And so you have there's this tension in any organization between trying to make the organism that you're a part of as successful as possible, like maximize the money, in this case, that's flowing through the organism, versus trying to maximize the amount that you, as a component of it, are personally acquiring. And so you get these like competing strategies of like cooperate and everybody gets a little bit more, or compete internally and like maybe you compromise the efficiency of the host overall, but that, you know, that doesn't matter to you. You don't care how many millions or billions of dollars the company that you're a part of is making. You only care about how much you're getting out of that company.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like I remember someone who worked at Facebook was telling me that it was always this big thing of jockeying to work on whatever project that Zuck was specifically interested in at the time, and there's where all the incentives went to, whether or not that was a good idea.
You know, and so like I can't necessarily be as good at email marketing, for instance, as somebody who like that's, you know, that's what they live and breathe. I can probably, as somebody who's like really personally invested in the thing that I'm doing, who, you know, is, my incentives are pretty clear, be better than the vast majority of people who don't have that direct stake in the project.
Yeah.
And, I mean, this is, you know this if you read a lot of Patrick McKenzie, there's so much, especially with the, you know, barrier entry of like, especially with the cost of putting a little bit of software into the world being really, really low, there's all kinds of things where you can bring software skills to bear. To like optimize various processes. Right.
Well, I mean, yeah, like it's still the early innings, I think, in terms of what software is going to be able to do for folks in the end, right? You know, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has probably been plucked. You know, I don't think we really need that many more task tracking apps,
sure,
that kind of thing.
Yeah,
we do. Who knows? But yeah, I think there's just still so much out there that's available. I know if you look at containers, for instance, just that little subsection of the market, workflows and DevOps and that kind of thing, I still think there's just so much to be discovered and so many things that are still big problems that can be bitten off a little bit at a time, and you never know, you could end up as the next HashiCorp or something like that.
Yeah, well, and there's stuff like, you know, I was talking about Fender guitar a little bit before we started recording. The story there is my partner buys guitars, and he was browsing Fender. Didn't buy anything. They didn't have the guitar that he wanted.
Good man.
Yeah. He mostly buys stuff from Sweetwater, which they're fascinating because they're going head to head with Amazon and they're winning. Fender, the next day, sends him an email. It's like, personalized recommendations, curated for you, hand-picked. These are guitars you might like. The guitars there were guitars that he'd been looking at earlier, you know, the previous day. So Fender knew that he was interested in those guitars because it just kept track of what they were on the website. Which, like, on one level is, like, kind of dumb. Like, it's just sort of a dumb thing to be describing the guitars that you looked at yesterday as, you know, hand-picked, curated for you. On the other hand, that email probably drives non-zero guitar sales, right? Like, potentially a lot of guitar sales, right? Of like, oh yeah, I did like that. I wandered away. Like, I got interrupted before I finished buying it. But yeah, sure, I'll buy that guitar, right?
Yeah. Well, it's just like I was telling you earlier. I couldn't even find the podcast software that I was using before. And if they'd just sent me a little email to remind me, I might still be using it.
There's lots of software, you know, that's software, right? That's, there's some cron job, right? There's some batch job that's running that's like, okay, what are all the sessions that we had yesterday? And, you know, how many of them looked at, you know, X number of guitars? And then let's send out an email that's got, you know, and pulled these images from a bucket somewhere, right? There's just a little bit of software. There's a little script running somewhere that's generating those emails. It's probably not a little script, actually. Fender hires data engineer. They have a big data pipeline. I kind of want to go work for Fender now. Like I've been looking at their hiring page, and I'm like, Vendor is doing some really interesting. They want people who know NoSQL and GraphQL. Okay.
Well, if you want to meet him, I know a guy that was telling you that they were customers at Honeycomb, and they wrote a little case study with us. But what's really interesting, I think, and to kind of hone in on what you're saying there, is that to me, software is really the differentiating factor that makes that work, right? Because anyone can blast out email, and they do plenty. But having that really custom kind of software that generates something that's just for you, that really hits the sweet spot to come get you back in the product, really requires some logic and some kind of custom thinking to get really clever. And I think that that's where there's a lot of still missing material, where software engineer is sort of the right hand that isn't talking to the left hand of marketing. We did a lot of really interesting work around stuff like that at Honeycomb, and still we could have taken it that much further. But I think it's just a natural sort of process of life that once the company grows, those kind of departments don't tend to not talk as much. And so you really have to have someone looking at the whole thing and getting them all to work on the sort of same page.
Which you can do, right? If like you are the engineering department and the marketing department, those departments still aren't always going to talk to each other. Humans are distributed systems on some level, right? Like we don't always coordinate with ourselves effectively. But like you're going to have much better odds than a much bigger company of like being able to go like, oh, hang on, is there a little bit of SQL that we could write that would help this?
Exactly. Yeah, that's something I really enjoy about the early startup environment, is you sort of by necessity, looking for survival, have to all look at each other and figure that kind of thing out. So I think we should wrap up, because there's so many great things, and I really appreciate you coming on. So wrapping up, anything you would like to plug, like any specific items, your Twitter or your blog?
Oh yeah, my Twitter is Nota, Nota _ Bennett, Bennett, and my blog is at www.simplermachines.com. So if you subscribe to that, you'll get me in your inbox once a week.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the pod, Nat, and I really look forward to seeing what's next and what's cool software stuff that you put out there in the world.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me. This was great.